Now, US President Joe Biden was surprised to learn that classified documents were found in a think tank office that Biden had once used. He said that he and his team are cooperating fully with the review into what had happened. President Joe Biden was speaking at a press briefing in Mexico. He defended how his lawyers, who found the files while clearing out the space, handled this discovery. But one must note that Joe Biden faces criticism from Republicans, especially as the Biden administration probes former President Donald Trump's handling of classified documents that were found at his Florida mar-a-lago residence. And now the Democrat president says he would cooperate with the review into his own case. It should be noted that Chicago U.S. Attorney John Losh was tasked to review the material found at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. This is the office, by the way, that Biden had used from 2017 until the start of his 2020 presidential campaign. Interestingly, John Losh is a Trump appointee as well. Now, Donald Trump's supporters have been trying to draw comparisons between the two cases, that of Donald Trump's with that of Joe Biden's. Here's a report.
US President Joe Biden on Tuesday said he was surprised to learn around a dozen classified government records were found at a private office he used to work in. Speaking at a press briefing in Mexico, he defended how his lawyers, who found the files while clearing out the space, handled their discovery.
They immediately call the archives, turn them over to the archives, and I was briefed about this discovery and surprised to learn that there were any government records that were taken there to that office. But I don't know what's in the documents. My lawyers have not suggested I ask what documents they were.
Biden faces criticism from Republicans as his administration probes former President Donald Trump's handling of classified documents found at his Florida mar-a-lago residence. The Democrat president says he would cooperate with a review into his own case.
I've turned over the boxes, they've turned over the boxes to the archives, and we're cooperating fully with the review, and which I hope will be finished soon, and there'll be more detail at that time.
Chicago U.S. Attorney John Losh, a Trump appointee, was tasked to review the material found at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, an office which Biden used from mid-2017 until the start of his 2020 presidential campaign. Trump and his supporters were trying to draw comparisons on Tuesday between the two cases, but Greg Sofer, a partner with Hush Blackwell, says there are notable differences.
Generally speaking, for me in my practice and the clients that I represent, it often makes a big difference when something's voluntarily disclosed to the government versus the government having to go out there and dig it up themselves.
An important distinction, says Paul Charlton, a former U.S. attorney in Arizona.
The allegations as it relates to President Trump are much different. When the National Archives asked for President Trump and his team to return those documents, they returned some documents, but not all documents. A grand jury subpoena was issued, some but not all documents were returned. A search warrant was issued, and sure enough, a number of other remaining top secret documents were still in former President Trump's possession.
The special counsel to the president said on Monday that classified material was identified by personal attorneys for Biden on November 2nd, days before the midterm elections. The Justice Department, the National Archives, and the think tank did not respond to a request for comment.
In the meantime, Republican lawmakers have requested that the U.S. intelligence community conduct a damage assessment of potentially classified documents that were found in the Washington office space of President Joe Biden's former institute. The request has been made to the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. It says that Biden's retention of the documents put him in a potential violation of laws protecting national security. And that also includes the Espionage Act and the Presidential Records Act. Irrespective of a federal review, the revelation that Biden potentially mishandled these classified or presidential records could prove to be a political headache for the president.
For years, when Vice President Biden left office, it looks like he took classified documents with him, and he was very critical of President Trump. By the way, the only person that has the constitutional ability to declassify any documents is the President of the United States, not the Vice President. So if Then Vice President Biden took classified documents with him and held them for years and criticized former President Trump during that same time that he had those classified documents, and only after it was uncovered did he turn them back. I wonder why the press isn't asking the same questions of him as vice president taking classified documents that they were asking President Trump.
This is Republican hypocrisy at its finest. When the former president had 320 documents found at his personal residence, they said that, quote, that will not be a priority. What President Biden did was disclose this to the archives, let law enforcement know. That is exactly the way that you should handle this. So we're going to support the fact that the president is following this established protocol, that he did the right thing, and see what other and see where we go from here. But we're not interested. Republicans aren't interested in having meaningful oversight. They're just interested in opposing this president. This was done in consultation. You saw Merrick Garland have a U.S. attorney weigh in at this point. This is being done the exact way, getting the archives involved. Someone who was on the January 6th committee, there is a process to handling documents. The president is handling it the way he should. That's what's important.
I did think of this, though, when you're living in a glass house, don't be throwing stones, right? And I always felt like it was overplayed, the search of the mar-a-lago. I think when you're going to do that to the next president, you got to be very careful, and I think it kept changing the threshold for just how vitriolic and the hyper-partisanship. I mean, it just took it to a new level, and I think to do that, they should have been very careful before they go in and do a search like that. Got to be careful with classified. I worked with classified for 30 years in the Air Force, and I think everybody should be held accountable regardless who they are for it, but I don't know if it's the same or not yet. I think I'll stand back and wait for more. Yeah, that was wrong because they knew this before the election and held it. That's not right. And when you cover up something before an election and then release it afterwards, that is probably a point that needs to be highlighted.
Now, let's also highlight that Biden's case differs from that of Donald Trump's. Biden's attorneys discovered fewer than a dozen classified records inside the office at the think tank and informed the U.S. National Archives of their discovery. They turned over the materials and claimed to cooperate with the archives and the Justice Department. Now, this is a sharp contrast to Donald Trump, who kept thousands of government records, including classified ones, inside his Florida residence for more than a year. That too after departing the White House. Moreover, he did not return them immediately or willingly, despite numerous requests by the National Archives. On that note, let's also listen in to what the US President Joe Biden has to say in his defense.
Well, let me get rid of the easy one first. People know I take classified documents and classified information seriously. When my lawyers were clearing out my office at the University of Pennsylvania, they set up an office for me, secure office in the Capitol. The 4 years after being vice president, I was a professor at Penn. They found some documents in a box in a locked cabinet, or at least a closet. And as soon as they did, they realized there were several classified documents in that box. And they did what they should have done. They immediately called the archives, turned them over to the archives, and I was briefed about this discovery and surprised to learn that there were any government records that were taken there to that office. But I don't know what's in the documents. My lawyers have not suggested I ask what documents they were. I've turned over the boxes. They've turned over the boxes to the archives, and we're cooperating fully with the review, and which I hope will be finished soon, and there'll be more detail at that time.
Now, the news that classified documents from Joe Biden's vice presidential days were discovered by the U.S. president's personal attorneys has spread fast. In fact, 2 former prosecutors said there seemed to be key differences between Biden's case and a separate Justice Department probe into former President Donald Trump's handling of highly sensitive classified documents, something I just referred to. Allegedly, Trump retained those documents at his Florida resort after leaving the White House in January 2021. Now, former US prosecutors are weighing in on these two cases that involve Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Let's listen in to what they have to say.
Well, it certainly makes a difference, just generally speaking, when somebody comes to the government and says, I found this stuff and here it is, versus the government feeling that it's got to go route it out. Again, I think in the Trump case, originally, I don't know exactly how this occurred, but it appears to me that somebody called the government and said, this stuff is here. The government showed up. They asked a bunch of questions, and originally they came to try to find out where these documents were and how they were stored. And clearly the government's taken the positions, because they went and got a search warrant, that they didn't get cooperation. And that's why you get these arguments that the president's people, at least, are potentially facing some sort of obstruction of justice issues. Here in the case of Biden, we're at the very beginning of this, so it's hard to really know what would or could happen in terms of these documents. But I'll just say, generally speaking, for me in my practice and the clients that I represent, it often makes a big difference when something's voluntarily disclosed to the government versus the government having to go out there and dig it up themselves.
There is this important aspect of the case. One is that it is clear that President Trump, former President Trump, is now the subject of a criminal investigation by the special counsel, Jack Smith. The prosecutor there, like prosecutors in every case, will have to prove that the president, the former President Trump, knew what he was doing was wrong. It was a knowing violation of the law. The current U.S. attorney in Chicago, a Trump holdover, will be looking at the same issue. Did then Vice President Biden, current President Biden, know what he was doing was in violation of the law, or, as the White House seems to be arguing, was this an inadvertence, at worst, a reckless act by not carefully putting these documents in a secure location? If there is no proof that the president knowingly violated the law, that President Biden knowingly violated the law, there will be no criminal prosecution. So those are differences that both these prosecutors, one in Chicago and one the special counsel, will be looking to see whether or not our current President Biden knowingly violated the law, or our former President Trump knowingly violated the law as well. There is supposed to be a very clear chain of custody. If you are the President of the United States and I hand you a classified document, there's supposed to be a log that shows I handed you this document, and then there's supposed to be a log that shows how that document was subsequently secured or destroyed. But it is a very good question that you're asking. It goes to a larger policy question. Why is it that all the way back to 2017, when these documents, at least some of them, had their birth with then Vice President Biden, now President Biden, why is it that those documents were allowed to go out into an environment where they weren't secured? Why is it that the National Archives wasn't asking back in 2017 or 2018, where are these classified documents? That's what should have happened there. That's probably what should have happened from the get-go with former President Trump.
In order to be prosecuted for violating some statutes, the information has to rise to the level of national defense information. So again, there are documents that are classified but don't fall into that category. So for certain kinds of violations, you'd have to have certain kinds of information. And obviously, the more highly classified something is, the more serious potentially the damage is to the United States. From an evidentiary standpoint, it makes a big difference. It's easier to say 10 documents were accidentally interspersed with non-classified information than it is to say 15 boxes were. That's just an easier argument to make, although again, it depends on the circumstances of each individual investigation, how difficult that argument is going to be to make. They require intent. And so if the president or his people thought that the documents were declassified, that could also potentially have an effect on the ability of the prosecution to go forward. You have to prove some kind of intent.
The number of documents will not be as important to the prosecutors who are reviewing both of these distinct cases as much as the significance of those individual documents are. So if it is something like a letter from the dictator of North Korea, and that was the only document, just hypothetically, that was found at Mar-a-Lago, well, that probably wouldn't be something that we would all concern ourselves with. On the other hand, if it is something that attaches to secrets overseas, then we would all be worried about that.
So there's two major sets of charges here. One has to do with the mishandling of classified, well, they both really have to do with the mishandling of classification. One imposes penalties for knowingly removing classified material without authority with the intent to keep it in an unauthorized location. And again, there you have to show that the person had that intent to do those things. There is another act, there's an act, the 1917 Espionage Act, which has only been rolled out, as far as I know, for prosecution once or twice in the history of the country. And that actually imposes a penalty for gross negligence. There's been some serious questions about its constitutionality, and that's, I think, why in large measure it hasn't been used very much. But those are the two major statutes. Now, if in the process of the FBI or some other federal law enforcement agency investigating these violations, you obstruct justice, which is what I think has been partially alleged, at least, or leaked with respect to the Trump investigation, that charge actually in many ways often is more serious than the underlying charge. And I see people all the time in my practice who commit some relatively minor crime, and turns out the obstruction charge ends up causing them way more problem. I'm not saying mishandling classified information is a minor crime. I'm just saying the government gets two bites at the apple if they think you've also obstructed justice in the process.